My New Year's resolution is playing more JRPGs or Japanese role-playing games. I am now 38, and with the imminent reality of fatherhood, I sit here thinking about my biggest regret. Okay, maybe not biggest. That would be not starting my YouTube channel earlier or not quitting my soul-crushing retail job earlier. No, my biggest regret as a gamer is missing the boat on these 10 or 11 or maybe even 12 Japanese role-playing games. I make this list for two reasons. One, because I am beginning to accept the reality that I will probably never go to Japan, and two, my country is such an embarrassing and shambling mess. I may not be able to leave, but I can at least choose how to spend the remaining time I have left in my head. I fell in love with Japanese role-playing games, more specifically the Final Fantasy brand of JRPG, after trying Final Fantasy IX in the year 2000. I quickly turned to Final Fantasy VII and VIII before arriving just in time to experience Final Fantasy X at the end of 2001. 9/11 just happened, and like every other millennial teen, it felt like my life was already over before it even began. Japanese role-playing games afforded me the solitude to escape the banality of a neoliberal world order for something a lot more chill and a heck of a lot more interesting. But lacking the right resources, I spent my teenage years choosing to play every Final Fantasy and neglecting most everything else. I followed a brand instead of creators. So I hope to rectify this wrong in my late 30s as I aspire to become more chill, to become a patient father to a daughter who didn't ask to be born into this utopia of endless consumption and impotence. The title of this video is The Greatest JRPGs I Have Never Played, but that is a technicality. For this video, I have played the opening 90 minutes to all of the games I've mentioned. To any connoisseur of the genre, you will know that 90 minutes of a JRPG is, as my former coworker once said, barely scratching the surface of scratching the surface. Every great JRPG must do one simple thing. It must be a good blunt to smoke every night before bed. There is no genre of game where chill is more fundamental to its core concept, but that doesn't mean the games on this list are easy. Quite the opposite. Every JRPG worth its salt must balance satisfying progression with the weightiness of good character development and hanging out in towns way cooler than the ones we've been dealt in our real life. So let's get to the list, shall we?
Number 10.
Phantasy Star IV. I was a Sega kid in the early 1990s. My brother was 10 years older than me and a sports fan, and so the Sega Genesis was the superior machine for sports enthusiasts. I fell in love with video games in his bungalow bedroom playing Mario Bros. 2 and 3, but man, getting Madden at 8 years old makes me nostalgic for Saturday mornings playing that thing while he was away at college. I didn't even know the Genesis pumped out JRPGs until fairly recently. The Phantasy Star series was something a jaded Final Fantasy fan might scoff at. We didn't need another one, but I couldn't have been more wrong after playing the first 90 minutes of Phantasy Star IV, End of the Millennium. I placed Phantasy Star IV 10th on this list because it was the game I was most skeptical about before trying, but the opening is just as memorable and consistent as anything else on this list, I can promise you that. Talking about a global climate catastrophe 4 years before Final Fantasy VII and a decade before Al Gore made global warming mainstream. The main character Alice is a woman, and even wilder, Phantasy Star IV was directed by a woman. Riko Kodama only directed 2 games in her short life. She had a prescient knack for mapping trends that would make it more enticing for women to play video games. Japan would eventually get games that focused more on cooking, fashion, and child rearing, while the West continued to unironically simulate how cool it would be to kill even more monsters and people with more and more guns. Guns we could eventually customize like an RPG. Ho 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 ho. Phantasy Star IV's plot doesn't progress until you're sexist towards Alice, when you have to request her measurements. Alice winds up her punch in all of its 16-bit glory, gleefully connecting with the gross old man quest giver. Alice proceeds to call him an old fart. Phantasy Star IV might be the first of these 10 games I decide to beat. Shoot.
It's number 9.
Infinite Undiscovery. I saw this game at a Babbage's, or maybe it was a GameStop, who cares, in 2008. I was about to turn 22, halfway through my final semester of college. My breath tasted like the stale beer I was yearning for later on that night because I had developed a habit of drinking roughly 80% of the nights I spent adjacent to Michigan State's campus. I was with my friend Brooke. We were spending a lazy December afternoon in East Lansing's Meridian Mall amidst the Midwestern shroud of a perpetually overcast darkness. I was there to reluctantly pick up Left 4 Dead. I'd been apathetic about video games since the double dose of disappointments that was 2006's Final Fantasy XII and Kingdom Hearts 2. I knew Left 4 Dead wouldn't break me out of my spell, but I desperately craved to understand why gamers were attached to this particular game. I never did understand why, save for the social feature that came pre-packaged with the game. If you didn't want to talk, you'd hate this game. And as someone who hates Call of Duty, as we were browsing GameStop's Xbox 360 section, I happened upon a JRPG with the most absurdly nonsensical title. I whispered to Brooke, ashamed, "Why would anyone call a game Infinite Undiscovery?" My friend, bless her heart, then proceeded to shriek at the top of her lungs, "Infinite Undiscovery!" to the two people that were in the GameStop/Babbage's, both of which I believe were employees. I didn't laugh, and I regret not laughing just about as much as I regret not having picked up a bargain bin priced Infinite Undiscovery over Left 4 Dead. Putting Infinite Undiscovery on a list of best games on its name alone should disqualify me from ever telling anyone what games they should play, but if you'll just allow me one more minute of your time, you'll soon notice a theme with this list. 4 out of the 10 games I've chosen happen to be Xbox 360 titles released in the latter half of the 2000s. Now, you might be thinking the same thing I thought in 2008. Aren't JRPGs a shameful relic of the past? But Microsoft made a concerted effort to get Western audiences aboard the JRPG bandwagon to overwhelmingly indifferent results. Infinite Undiscovery released in North America 10 days before its Japan release, if that is any indication. But this game wasn't just met with apathy, it was actively dragged through the mud in the West, garnering mediocre to abysmal reviews from esteemed critics, who all got the memo that the JRPG was now cringe. And yeah, there is no other game on this list as janky and obtuse in its design, but Infinite Undiscovery is also hilarious and batshit insane in mostly a good way. I can't tell you another game I played where the flute-playing main character repeatedly keeps telling a woman she looks terrible and tired.
You look off. Want to rest?
Just leave me alone. Hi, Capel.
You look terrible. Shouldn't you try and get some rest?
Or explaining to a guard while imprisoned why he deserves to eat after being starved for 3 days. This punk was doing Brat Summer 16 years before it became trendy.
Really? I must need to practice more. Anyway, could you bring me some of that food I asked for? Ow! Hey, you didn't have to hit me.
Fight down! 8.
Shin Megami Tensei V. I needed a game on this list that wasn't about traveling to towns chock full of both anxious and grateful citizens. A game mostly about introverted combat in a reality without any people. A game about what it means to be different, and a game that gives you the space to explore your identity without a narrative urgently pushing you forward as everything around you threatens to crumble into dust, because everything already has. Shin Megami Tensei V doesn't have party members. It doesn't feature a trendy high school. Well, it does real quick at the beginning, but things take a turn for the worse real quick. Megaten 5, which is what the cool kids say, is a hardcore JRPG post-extinction of the human race. You play as a non-binary protagonist who collects and summons demons, Pokemon style, with Dark Soulsian difficulty spikes. The Megaten series has always been about not only killing God, but becoming one. If there's one lesson to be learned from Christianity, it isn't that we ascend to heaven in some afterlife, but rather that God has already descended down to earth and into the community of the faithful. Jesus died so that we could become gods together. And one more thing to the straight men watching this, it's perfectly normal to find trans women hot. Because they are. And if that possibility disgusts you, maybe stop thinking about how that might make you gay and more about how beauty is entirely subjective. Haven't you ever heard the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder? And wouldn't beauty best be determined by the person who is inhabiting that body? This is the 21st century. The more you can play with your sex and gender and identity, the more fun you'll have as a human being. I was originally toying with the idea of putting Persona 5 Royale on this list because I've technically never touched Persona 5 Royale, but time is a finite thing and Megaten 5 is a hard enough video game as is. Probably the hardest game on this list.
Coming in at number 7.
Blue Dragon. Gamers and critics love to tout Ni no Kuni as being the example of cel shading done right in video games. It has the brand and seal of approval of Studio Ghibli, after all. Blue Dragon, the first of Hironobu Sakaguchi's 2 JRPGs developed exclusively for the Xbox 360, featured a soft vinyl presentation to the characters that has aged gracefully in its 17 years of existence. If you yearn for the golden age of early to mid-90s SNES RPGs, Blue Dragon represents the platonic ideal of that, but with a first-party budget and 2007 tech. A budget that could afford Deep Purple frontman Ian Gillan to lend his voice to multiple boss themes in the game. The fact that Nobuo Uematsu was able to get the guy from his favorite classic rock band might seem like a perfunctory boomer move in 2024, but I dare any of you to sit here and tell me Final Fantasy VII's Bostonian boss battle theme is bad. Nobuo Uematsu's soundtracks are godly, and a large reason why is that late 70s prog rock influence. Oh, and did I mention that Akira Toriyama, the most influential manga artist and character designer of all time, worked on this game? A dream team, no doubt. But don't let name recognition alone sell you. Blue Dragon is an RPG overflowing with neat ideas. The headshots of the characters, even NPC ones, within their text boxes conveying a deliciously real-time flavor to the experience. There's a beefy, customizable job system that rewards experimentation. The healer in your party, Jiro, is a male, while Kluk, the badass black mage who hits devastatingly hard, is a woman. But I'll admit, the first couple of hours are a bit of a chore. That dinosaur boss fight proves an unfortunate end to an unfortunate vertical slice to a game I promise gets significantly better once you grind and earn a few spells. I'm kidding, it's great. It's just very difficult, and it prepares you for Lost Odyssey. All quibbles aside though, this is a must-play for any earnest lover of the genre, only to be overshadowed by one other Mistwalker game on this list. But this beginning, I love it, is truly a test in patience. You must defend to get through the dinosaur, but you also have to live with not having the protect spell yet, which would help immensely during his vicious tail whip. Do not attack him when he has the tail up. The game will reward you for defending and not attacking, I promise.
Cease.
Moon Remix RPG Adventure. I needed a PlayStation RPG for this list because it's here I admit to omitting Suikoden, Suikoden 2, Legend of Legaia, Wild Arms, Xenogears, Vagrant Story, Parasite Eve, Legend of Dragoon, and place in its stead the quintessential anti-RPG before Undertale, Moon Remix RPG Adventure. Moon is the strangest game on this list, and that is precisely why I loved the 90 minutes I've spent with it. There is no combat. The hero is a psychopathic murderer. Ride his genocidal coattails and your main character will drop dead, prompting a game over screen. The only way forward in Moon is love and curiosity. Use your money, or yemen, your Granby generously gives to you to buy her a loaf of bread at the quirky bakery, where a man named Baker bakes bread. Resurrect the soul of a dead slime, slain by the hero, in order to level up your love, the game's core gameplay mechanic. The word postmodern used to get thrown around by anyone looking for an award of the arbitrarily smartest person in the room, but Moon deconstructs the JRPG like no other. Moon opens on a CRT television. A boy is reprimanded by his mother for staying up all night, binging a JRPG about saving the world. Realms of text that we don't have time to read flash by as we play an extremely brief section as the aforementioned hero, who is comically overleveled. We're thrown violently into the world of Moon, but the world is anything but. It is peaceful, predicated on earnest coexistence. For anyone who is tired of RPGs whose core mechanic remains hacking and slashing till death, look no further than this gem of a forgotten masterpiece, and help those of us who are also tired of violence to sing the praises of Moon together.
It's number 5, Midway Point.
Dragon Quest III. An admission, I have never beaten a Dragon Quest game. An even sadder admission, I've only played the first 6 hours of Dragon Quest XI twice before bowing out each time because it felt too slow, too whimsical, whatever that means. Hopefully you're beginning to see a theme here. Dragon Quest VII was a late PlayStation 1 release. Its North American release date was the same year the PlayStation 2 boasted its murderer's row of AAA contenders. Metal Gear Solid 2, Grand Theft Auto 3, Silent Hill 2, Final Fantasy X, the list goes on and on and on. Who in the hell would want to play a pixelated 200-hour JRPG at the turn of the century? Definitely not me. If Dragon Quest XI is molasses, then Dragon Quest VII is wet cement, is what a complete idiot would say. There's infamously no battles in the first handful of hours of DQ7, which that alone should pique your curiosity. I am choosing to play the Dragon Quest III HD 2D remake instead because right now, Dragon Quest VII is only available for me to play on an emulator, and I don't own a gaming PC or know how to set up a MiSTer. My DMs are open. Dragon Quest III is also a far shorter game. It's not whimsical, there's that word again that I don't know what it means. It's a chill experience. Elden Ring probably wouldn't exist without Dragon Quest III. Did you know that Dragon Quest III takes place on a planet Earth that is dying and in desperate need of saving? Did you know that you can customize not only the physical features of your party members, but your jobs? You can literally make your friends and family. Maybe I'll get to Dragon Quest VII once I retire at age 90, but for now, I look forward to playing Dragon Quest III with the anticipation of a man whose brain has finally begun to recover from all the bad faith takes over the years that convinced me to buy a PlayStation 3 for Final Fantasy XIII. And turn that auto battle on, for God's sake. The developers put that in the game for a reason. Dragon Quest III was the game that made me appreciate the chaotic randomness of pachinko machines. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing.
4.
Lost Odyssey. It feels downright unfair to place Lost Odyssey at number 4. Hironobu Sakaguchi got the shaft at Microsoft after making two of the most overlooked JRPGs of the century. I wouldn't have even made this list if not for Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey. It would be a fool's errand to sum up the first 4 hours, yeah, I cheated for this one, of Lost Odyssey I played for this video, and it would most certainly exceed the word count I've arbitrarily given myself when assembling this list. It is a game which focuses on a man who has been alive for 1,000 years. Like the Highlander, Kaim cannot die. I was gobsmacked by 3 prestige moments just in the opening hours of this game alone. All came from reading short stories penned by prolific author Kiyoshi Shigematsu. Kaim is an immortal with amnesia, but there are several moments in Lost Odyssey where a memory will unlock within, and we the player are witness to reading some of the most verbosely concise literature ever presented in video game format. The first short story we get is Hannah's Departure, a tale of a young girl who is gravely ill. Her greatest passion is listening to other people's stories. Kaim often feels sorry for himself for being an old man who can't die, but the warmth Hannah's curiosity gave him was 1,000 times greater than whatever warmth alcohol could ever give him. I say this sincerely, Lost Odyssey makes me proud to be a gamer, despite the lack of interest it garnered in the West, but that seems more like a Western problem than a JRPG problem. Lost Odyssey is also pretty difficult, at least in the beginning. The Sakaguchi on-ramp requires the player early mastery and understanding of the equipment and spell menus. Consider the way Jeff Gerstmann has never gotten a Final Fantasy. He doesn't understand the concept of black magic, opting instead to whack common enemies with the wand of a mage and wondering why people love Final Fantasy, instead of trying to engage with the game in good faith. Like, come on, Unk, all you have to do is look up a guide for like 5 minutes to understand how black magic spellcasting works. Your pride can handle it. In Sakaguchi's games, the player must purchase spells from a vendor, but once you have it, every member of your party who can cast magic has that spell forever. There's a moment in Blue Dragon where an innkeeper suggests you speed up the pace of the game, and she will constantly remind you of this as I impatiently scrolled through it like an ADHD-addled man-child, because I kept going back to the inn to recover my HP and MP after grinding for a few minutes here and there. I was doing this because I was grinding in order to defeat the dinosaur boss who impedes your progress, but like Dragon Quest, you don't need to grind in Blue Dragon or Lost Odyssey, but you do need a rather advanced understanding of the menus and spellcasting fairly early on. Lost Odyssey's first boss is even more difficult than Blue Dragon's dinosaur. Tim Rogers calls Lost Odyssey Final Fantasy with a Michelin star. I spoiled one of the game's heart-wrenching plot twists for myself, which I'll just say has to do with all of Kaim's time spent living on this planet and a blood relative. And speaking of blood relatives,
It's number 3.
Nier and Nier Replicant. Do I enjoy being sad? Almost certainly. I'm cheating by putting a remake or remaster on this list as well. Most everyone knows 2017's Nier Automata, Tokoyaro's transformative sequel that explored some mind-bending philosophical concepts out of the books of Pascal and Nietzsche. It is a game about replaying the same world-ending scenario with different characters. But that's the thing, humanity has already been wiped out. Spoilers. That is Automata's great plot twist, and it shook me almost as violently as Kojima's rug pull 16 years earlier in the postmodern Metal Gear Solid 2. I devoured Nier Automata like a chicken quesadilla over a vacation week in January of 2018. I spent most of the vacation indoors and away from people. When I wasn't playing Nier Automata, I was catching up on movies I didn't have time for in 2017 because I was too busy replaying humiliating memories in my head during my time working my soul-crushing retail job. The one time I did decide to leave the house, I drove to the Taco Bell drive-thru. On the way there, I passed a familiar man trudging a gray and wet Midwestern winter. He was a regular at the retail job I worked, but he rarely bought anything save for scratch-off lottery tickets. He would return bottles and then vampirically attach himself to any poor soul who was willing to listen. He had a quiet demeanor, but something about his calmness came off as hauntingly entitled. He often complained that we were out of stuff, despite never buying anything. He wore the same thing every day he came to the store. He attached himself to me because I was a people pleaser back then. I was good at two things in 2017, making miserable people happy and making myself profoundly unhappy. Back when Family Video was still on its last vestiges of life support, I noticed a loan copy of 2010's Nier chilling in the Xbox 360 section, always available for rent. The minimalist box art of a tired old man appealed to me, but by 2010 I'd been so brain-rotted by the West's indifference to JRPGs that I constantly disregarded it. I would rent Shadow of Mordor, Alien Isolation, and Knack as Nier pitifully stood there isolated and alone, like that cheap old man who complained calmly and purchased lottery tickets, who he always said were for a friend. I wanted to run and hide every time he came into the store, always from having walked a shit ton of miles. He always walked. I'd see him miles away from the retail store I worked. The Taco Bell I went to was 15 miles from where I worked. I don't think he ever took the bus. Maybe he felt above taking the bus. I worked in a pretty affluent area. There are two versions of Nier. Both games are completely the same except for one key difference: the main character. In the Nier Replicant remaster, you play as Yona's brother. In the original 360 version, you play as her father, a decrepit old man. After devouring Nier Automata over a godless week of hedonism, I browsed YouTube clips of Nier with feverish anticipation. But even in 2018, I couldn't yet unscratch the ick of Nier's initial reception. Automata had been christened playable by the West, but it would take a remake and the scrubbing of bad faith takes for me to finally say it was time to play Nier. Regardless of the version you play, Yona's sickness means that the unnamed main character is fiercely overprotective of her. She's like a feminine version of Nietzsche. Yona asks to fetch her a book during your very first quest, which is to murder 3 sheep and take their mutton back to a vendor for gold. Neither old man dad nor teenage brother have time to listen to her request, so we find her in the library and later on in the old shrine so she can acquire a spell that will forever undo her illness. The amount of anxiety I had when I realized she'd run off already makes this game at least as good as Nier Automata, and that's just in the first 90 minutes.
The penultimate, number 2.
Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. There is a scene during the flashback of Nibelheim in which Cloud replays the events of what happened when he passed through with Sephiroth 5 years prior. We can choose to walk into Tifa's house. We can even go into her bedroom and poke around her stuff. She will be greatly disturbed if you do this, but this is role-playing. Of course, I understand the hypocritical nature of placing a Final Fantasy game near the top of this list, when the goal for this entire project was to play games that aren't a Final Fantasy, but I haven't actually sat down and played Final Fantasy VII Rebirth yet. Final Fantasy VII might be the most apocalyptically important video game of our lifetime. There's a decent chance the PlayStation brand doesn't exist, or at the very least isn't what it is today without the monumental influence of Final Fantasy VII in 1997. I was too young and too dumb to have played the SNES RPG classics, but Final Fantasy VII still seared the outer flesh off my brain when I first played it in early 2001. I was giddy waiting for the PlayStation 2. Patiently waiting 8 hours at a friend's house as we illegally downloaded the Metal Gear Solid 2 trailer off Kazaa, and still playing Final Fantasy VII for the first time felt like the next generation. I have talked briefly about other Final Fantasies on this list. I've even waxed tragically about Final Fantasies 12 and 13. I haven't even talked about the sort of non-event that was Final Fantasy 15, and I know there are fans of that game. Final Fantasy VII might not be the greatest Final Fantasy game, but as an old Japanese game and music critic who used to work at Sony Computer Entertainment once said, Final Fantasy VII is either going to save the world or end it. People like to make fun of Final Fantasy, making such defiantly bold claims such as, it's only a Dragon Quest clone, but no one does epic struggle as cinematically as Square does with Final Fantasy. The sheer number of prestige moments, save for the Empire Strikes Back section of the trilogy, is staggering, though it respects its source material greatly. PlayStation 1's Final Fantasy VII's middle section was also full of prestige, Gaia-shattering opera house moments. The three I can think of off the top of my head is Cloud and Sephiroth's encounter at Nibelheim, the infamous double date at the Golden Saucer, and of course the momentous climax in which dies at the hands of Sephiroth. Rebirth lost out to Astrobot at the Game Awards. The Final Fantasy VII Remake lost out to The Last of Us Part 2 at 2020's Game Awards. Final Fantasy VII is the definitive runner-up, a game that will probably never be number one in anyone's heart, but it's still the first game everyone thinks of when we think of the future of video games. 27 years after its release and staggering influence, Rebirth is both a triumph and a sobering reminder of how little things have changed. Final Fantasy XIII would change the series forever. The Final Fantasy VII Remake delicately blended its linear hallways with classy towns. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth looks to introduce the non-linearity of the second half of Final Fantasy XIII. That was perhaps the most prestigious moment of all in the original Final Fantasy VII, leaving Midgar and being bludgeoned with the reality that this world is more than just Midgar, a hell of a lot more. No wonder no one can decide what is the canonical length of time one spends in Midgar. Square made an entire game out of it. Now we get the overworld.
Honorable mention time.
Before we talk about number one, I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking even more about the brand that has, for better or worse, monopolized the JRPG discourse for over 3 decades. I've chosen 2 games for this honorable mention portion of the list: a reimagining of Final Fantasy I and a fan-fiction-y prequel to Final Fantasy VII. Crisis Core originally released for the PSP all the way back in 2007. Dirge of Cerberus was a character action game starring a hidden playable party member in Final Fantasy VII, while Zack Fair's involvement in Final Fantasy VII is locked behind many optional cutscenes. The fact that we got 2 full-length games dedicated to obscure Final Fantasy VII characters is a testament to the influence of the game. I had a blast playing through the opening hours of Zack Fair's story. Crisis Core features bite-sized missions, an action-based coherent battle system that isn't too overbearing, and an obscene amount of time reading fellow soldier emails. Turns out the world of Final Fantasy VII isn't immune to bureaucracy either. Despite being a massive Final Fantasy fan, I have never played the one that started it all. I'm genuinely excited that I get to play this hilarious reinterpretation of the original. Origin is a Souls-like, kinda, developed by Team Ninja, makers of the legendarily difficult Ninja Gaiden action platformers, and fellow Souls-like franchise Nioh, or Nioh. I'm not sure how to pronounce it exactly. And while I enjoyed the opening hour of this reimagining, I was also relieved that this was the final RPG I touched for this video, because I don't know how many more tutorial screens I have the patience to endure. Every 5 seconds there's another tutorial screen in this game, and I am a little disappointed that Square got the license for Frank Sinatra's My Way instead of Limp Bizkit's, because there is something unabashedly new metal about Origin's headphone-wearing heroes. These bros look like they just discovered Jordan Peterson and want to repeat his main talking point about order and chaos.
My mission is to kill chaos. That's all I know.
Me too.
Good. We're all on the same hunt.
I'm Jack.
Jed.
Ash.
Number 1.
Metaphor ReFantazio. I was originally going to place Metaphor at number 10 on this list because I wanted to be pessimistic. If video games have indeed gotten worse with time, then it would hold that Atlus's latest will not stand the test of time. I played the luxuriously lengthy demo Atlus generously ingratiated us with, 5 to 6 hours of a free game, and the remaining 95% paywalled behind Sony's $69.99 price tag. Metaphor ReFantazio released 3 days after the Silent Hill 2 remake. I was so immersed in Silent Hill 2, worrying about getting a molar tooth extracted, and trying to understand the gears of late capitalism that I completely forgot Atlus was working on a new IP. I come to you with yet another shameful admission. I have never beaten a Shin Megami Tensei, nor have I beaten a Persona game. The closest I ever came was 2017's Persona 5, the most popular Atlus game in the West. I'm sure you noticed by now that throughout this list that I am in fact a poser when it comes to the Japanese role-playing game genre, despite having so much of my adolescence and teenage years defined by prestige moments in Final Fantasies 6, 7, 8, 9, and most certainly 10. So then why number 1? Am I in my optimist romanticist arc? It's a blind wager, sure, but I've always had this rather naive hope for the cynical people in the world to become less cynical. I say this as someone who can be overbearingly cynical at times, depending on my mood. In October of 1998, I was so excited for WCW's Halloween Havoc that I joyfully and unironically exclaimed to my friends how legitimately excited I was for the stacked card. Hogan versus Warrior 2, Nash versus Hall, Steiner versus Steiner, Page versus Goldberg, and Hitman versus the Icon Sting. My friends laughed at me in the predictably obnoxious way a late 90s teenager would laugh at a romanticist. So I learned to shut myself down, to use myself as a joyless vessel that projected outward interest in everyone else's life while stifling my own. I pretended to care about other people's problems when in reality all I was doing was playing my favorite video games in my head again and again and again. I am no longer a people pleaser, but I am hoping Metaphor ReFantazio is the RPG to knock cynical management and profit trends so exceptionally over the head that we start getting more of these again. The reason I made this video and devised this list was mostly so I could wax nostalgic about underrated Xbox 360 RPGs no one in the West has ever bothered to play. But Metaphor ReFantazio asks a horrifically relevant and prescient question. What if the West never fell out of love with JRPGs in the mid to late 2000s? Metaphor ReFantazio is another JRPG about a group of underdogs looking to triumph over monolithic evil despite the odds. JRPGs have always been socialist in execution, and it is no surprise that Metaphor is Atlus's most overtly political game. It's not every game that can acknowledge that fantasy can be more real than reality, because Metaphor asks another poignant question within its first 10 minutes. Is fantasy limited to the confines of the imagination? Would you call it a powerless creation? Also, this game has vaping in it. In her memoir Dirtbag, socialist writer Amberly Frost compares gamers, whether consciously or not, to two mentally ill and unhoused men she names Jim and Bob on a New York subway arguing about bats. One of them believed the other was behaving in such a way as to summon a horde of unwanted bats in the subway. Quote, Jim responded with hostility, but with a complete and total acceptance of the bats as a reality. Jim then accused Bob of calling the bats, not obliviously or even unintentionally, as Bob had accused Jim, but in fact to frame Jim for the ensuing plague of bats. End quote. The bats obviously don't exist, but Frost uses this example to highlight her indifference towards Gamergate, a political cultural war that defined one side as racist and misogynist, the other as too woke and too virtuous. She even suggests that being a gamer is even more embarrassing than being a virgin. Look, I don't like the term either, but I don't make the rules. Her metaphor is reductive, and as much as I admire Bernie Sanders, he's not the 21st century bastion of obscenity that Trump is. Democratic socialism is a relic of the 20th century, desperately clinging on to the vestiges of morality. Video games aren't radical theory, and radical theory hasn't changed the world, and yet I desperately cling on to anyone willing to listen how important video games can be as attention vacuums. Forgive me for judging, but there is definitely something to be said about someone who plays 3 hours of Call of Duty a day and someone who plays 3 hours of JRPGs per day. Is one better than the other? I don't know, but I'm also not the type of socialist who is earnestly going to try to convince you to go outside and touch grass by protesting. Occupy Wall Street proved how utterly inept boots-on-the-ground protesting has become, probably because it was more anarchist in its execution than socialist, but that's for another video. Metaphor's opening hours mimic another Final Fantasy VIII. The first quarter of that game revolves around a failed assassination attempt of the Queen. Metaphor opens with a failed assassination attempt on the guy who assassinated the king. I assume the remaining 90 hours of Metaphor are about picking yourself back up and trying again, as the iconic Aaliyah song suggests, but every modern attempt at socialism has been an unmitigated failure in the West. So if video games don't have the potential to change the world, what are they good for? Call of Duty is used as a teaching tool to quite literally develop the twitch-like reflexes a cop will need on the streets. Heck, the members of the US Army who dropped bombs on Iraq and Afghanistan learned how through early Atari and PC video games. But what if, bear with me here, video games could also teach us how to cook, how to help a fellow brother or sister in need, how to check ID papers, how to have empathy, how to become more fashionable. Saving the world is gauche these days, I admit, but the JRPG is about more than saving the world. It's about, to quote newly elected Pope Benitez in the critically acclaimed Best Picture nominee Conclave, how to exist between the worlds of certainty. Thanks for watching.